All right, welcome everyone. I hope you all have questions, thoughts, even problems that you have possibly about working with crystals that we can discuss tonight, and I can definitely provide you some answers. Every once in a while the answer is I don't know, but that's still an answer. I do what I can. Many of you know who I am and what I do. For those of you who don't, I'm Katarina Elaine, and I work at the Aquarius Metaphysical Store, which is the largest metaphysical store in the Midwest. And one of the things we specialize in is crystals. We've got thousands. I have been interested in crystals a long time before that job, though. So I've been working with these for easily a decade. I love, love, love rocks. Who doesn't? As far as kind of introducing this class and what we're going to talk about, working with crystals falls into the category of natural magic. So there are all kinds of different sorts of magic and ways to categorize the practices that we have. But for like comparison, natural magic would be very different from ceremonial magic. It's a whole different thing. Natural magic is incredibly intuitive. It really works with intuition and nature-centered. Obviously, it's all based around nature. So as a person who is a crystal fanatic, but also an eclectic traditional witch, I do like to make it clear that working with crystals was never actually a part of traditional witchcraft. So witchcraft is this big kind of umbrella term that is changing to include all sorts of practices, but traditional witchcraft didn't involve smudging or working with crystals. That's new stuff that we've learned how to do. And for very good reasons, lots of modern witches like myself have been working crystals into their practices. And that's become a part of what we do. Lots of good reasons. Because it's satisfying, first of all. Working with crystals is really simple and really, really satisfying. It appeals to the animal brain and to the primal self, to the magpie mind, if you will. The earliest humans obviously lived in caves and lived around rocks and crystals, and that was where we found our security. That was where we had our home, and we have this connection with them that's very primal, that's kind of still a part of us somewhere in that DNA. So working with rocks and working with crystals, it's very, very primal and very important to us. So let's see. I have possible material that I can cover tonight, but this class was created as a question and answer session. So I really kind of like to focus on community questions first and then just see where that leads us, because working with crystals is such a huge subject to cover. So let's just try to make sure we get everybody's questions answered. There is definitely no question too dumb. That's not a thing. There's no question too stupid or crazy. I have heard it all. I work with beginners all the time at the shop. It's fine. Like, I'm going to be cool with it, just so you know. And we've already dealt with muted mics. So to get into questions, let's go ahead and try to use the raise hand option. Just in case anybody hasn't used it, down at the bottom, there's a thing that says reactions. And if you click that, there's an option for raise hand. And if everyone would try that real fast. Okay. So I see at least one. There we go. Everybody's got it going on. So that's a pretty good way for me to be able to see who's got a question and who wants to talk. And then if you're, if you're doing the talking, obviously you got to unmute your mic. So we'll work with that. Now, if you have your hand up right now, there's also an option after you've clicked raise hand to lower your hand. So if something happens and your question gets answered or whatever, you can just do that and that'll go away. And that solves that. So does anyone have a question to start with? Anybody going to be really brave and get this going? Ooh, all right. Oh, we got someone. Ari, hi, thanks. We can't hear you yet. Your mic is muted.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. So I wanted to know, I've heard that you can like boil crystals in your other potions. I've never done that. Is that something that you can do? And two, what does that bring to the table?
Interesting one. So it's not something I would recommend to start with. There are a lot of crystals that have different sort of chemicals in them that are going to be toxic to the human body. Even things like arsenic, things like copper. So depending on what crystal it is, if you were to boil it in water or even leave it in your water and then ingest it, that could be really harmful for you. So some crystals, quartz, probably going to be fine in a bath, going to be fine in water, but you have to be really careful about anything that is being used in water. There are also a lot of other crystals that in boiling water would just fall apart. It would degrade them. They would break down, or simply just be changed by the heat to maybe even break. So that would be a really tricky one. You would want to make sure that you were using crystals that you had done a lot of research on to know that they're not going to break down and they're not going to, have any release of toxic stuff. And then as far as what that brings to the table, a lot of natural magic is just like layering different bits of energy together. You're just building more energy. And the more little things that you do, the more energy you build. So if you're doing a spell and you include some crystals and you also include a candle and then you also include some herbs, every little thing just adds to it. So I can see why people would want to add crystals to that. It's maybe not the best idea though. Anybody else got any thoughts? Okay. Let me pull up some of the common questions that I get. And it's going to take me just a second here. So one thing that people get mixed up a lot in the shop is the difference between gemstones and crystals. There's actually technically a difference between minerals and stones and rocks and crystals and gemstones. Like they're all technically completely different, scientific things. Most of that I don't actually know. It doesn't really apply to me, but the difference between gemstones and crystals is pretty important because people often come in looking for a gemstone and not realizing that that is something different than what a crystal is. And the difference actually just comes down to quality. Things like aquamarine and ruby and emerald and even sapphire and peridot, they all can be crystals. They have a crystal grade, a crystal quality, and you can find them in crystal shops being sold in that way. But gemstones are a certain quality of that crystal, usually used for jewelry, maybe cut and polished. They don't have to be, but they do have to be of a certain quality. So sometimes people also come in looking for like topaz and opal, which really, they don't really have crystal quality. All of it that you can find is really like gemstone quality and very rare and hard to find, which is really unfortunate for people with those birthstones. So sometimes you do have to end up paying a lot more money for a gemstone if you're looking for something very specific. So gemstones can be very costly, and really quality is the difference there. I'm gonna stop and check for questions real quick here.
We do have one in the chat.
Okay.
Eliza says, do you have any good resources for which crystals to use for specific ailments? She's like interested in helping to ease chronic pain and anxiety.
Yeah. So first of all, when it comes to crystal healing, this is a bit tricky, but ultimately it's our bodies that have the power to heal. Our bodies are responding to whatever we introduce to them we are using crystals as a way to communicate to the body and to say, this is what I need you to do. I need you to address this issue. I need you to heal this here. It's a way of communication between our conscious mind and that like unconscious body that we often struggle to understand. Because the body does have the power to do all of that healing. So the answer you're going to get for what crystal to use for what ailment and this and that is going to be really different depending on person, and potentially probably any of them could work. What really matters is that it makes sense to you. So if you're trying to use a crystal to heal and it makes sense and you like how it's working, then it's going to be more effective. But if someone says use this crystal and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense at all, then it's probably not going to be very effective because it involves your body and your energy. Bloodstone is one that has been used. It has some history of being used for physical ailments. It's said to help circulation, that kind of thing. So Bloodstone is usually one I recommend for anything involving physical health. And things involving anxiety, I personally really like lepidolite and amethyst for stuff like that. But again, these are kind of objective. There's not currently any scientific way to prove that this crystal does this thing, right? All we have is a bunch of people's experiences, and history can kind of guide us. History can say, well, people used it for this a long time, and then we go, we have reason to believe that that probably works if people have been using it for a long time for that. But objectively, we can't say, oh, this will definitely heal that. We just work with them personally and figure out what works for us. Have we got any? I see Henry has a question. You want to unmute your mic? Go for it.
Hi. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday about some issues I had. At the end of the conversation, they were like, "Hey, pull out like these 3 crystals and just carry them around for a little bit." And it was just kind of surprising to me. I'd only ever used like 1 crystal at a time. Is that a thing you see a lot, to like just carry like a handful, like use multiple stones for the same thing at the same time?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, you do see that a lot. You wouldn't believe the way that some people come in and they have like layers upon layers of necklaces that are just like crystals, and then also like bags in their pockets. And I can be a little bit like that, but mostly I just keep mine stacked around my house, right? Yeah, absolutely. You can use multiple crystals all for the same thing. And it's kind of personal. This is a very intuitive kind of magic. So if it's weird for you, maybe don't do it, right? But if you're like, okay, this makes sense. I've got these 3 crystals. They all kind of are related to mental health. So I'm going to carry these together and it's going to help me with my mental health today. Absolutely do that. I have sometimes had people ask me if crystals like negate each other, which is a really interesting thought. I have never known that to be true. When I think of crystal energies, I mean, they all come from the earth for one. And I think of them as just kind of pairing with each other. They're kind of stacking with each other. I've not known them to conflict in any way. I wouldn't say, oh, you definitely can't put those crystals together in a bowl for magic reasons. Maybe you can't put those crystals in a bowl because like one of them's salt and whatever, they're going to rub on each other and one of them's going to break. Sometimes for science reasons, you don't want to put 2 crystals in a bowl. But otherwise, I don't see any reason why they would be conflicting with each other and not being able to be together, unless you just personally, when you work with them, feel like they need to be in these certain places. And again, back down to sort of personal intuition, because that's what a lot of natural magic is about. We got anything else?
We do have another one in the chat. Says, are there stones that are best for those just starting out?
Yes and no. Quartz, I like to recommend quartz for just starting out because it's not easy to hurt quartz. It's not easy to break it. It's not easy to, it's not gonna have problems if you put it in a bath underwater. It's not toxic. It's not porous. So quartz is pretty great. And when I say quartz, I am talking about the entire rainbow scheme of quartz. So quartz actually does come in every color of the rainbow, all the way from purple, you know, to red, all of them. Some of them are a little more unusual than others. Dumortierite, which is quartz that has blue in it, is kind of uncommon to see. There is like tangerine quartz and whatnot that has certain mineral inclusions that turn it orange. And one of my absolute favorites is lithium quartz that has the mineral lithium in it that turns it very light purplish. Amethyst and citrine are both also a form of quartz. So quartz comes in every color of the rainbow, so it can be used for, you know, find one for every chakra if you want. You can do that pretty easily. And yeah, very, very easy to work with.
We do have, oh, sorry. We have another in the chat asking about crystal grids for thoughts and recommendations on crystal grids.
Crystal grids are fun. That's my thoughts and recommendations. So it's a very mindful practice doing a crystal grid. And it's kind of self-explanatory. It can be done very intuitively. It can be done with a lot of extra research on sacred geometry, so you can use certain shapes for certain purposes. It's almost like baking. It's like you get to make a cake, but you're just using shapes and crystals. And then when you align them a certain way, you can feel the energies doing their thing. So yeah, crystal grids are often awesome. I recommend them. They're fun to do underneath your bed to help like with dreaming and that kind of thing, especially because you spend so much time there. You really have a lot of time to sit there and soak up the energy that is happening with that crystal grid under the bed. And really anywhere else in your house, they're fun to do, provided that you do not have like cats that are going to mess with them. Got anything else for now? No? Okay.
Real quick, just back on like the gemstone versus the crystal.
Yeah.
So if you have them as the gemstone versus the crystal, could you use them as a substitute for each other, or is that going to harm your practice?
I don't see why it would. So an aquamarine crystal and an aquamarine gemstone are literally the same thing. The only difference is that quality and that purity that jewelry makers look for in gemstones. This is like an aquamarine crystal that is raw, right? It has that aquamarine shape, very cool. Obviously, it's very different from the gemstones that you have seen in the world, but still the same thing. So whichever really appeals to you most. I actually always hated the aquamarine gemstone, and I didn't like aquamarine at all until I found that big raw hunk. Whatever appeals to you the most is going to work, and you can use both of them, yeah. Have I answered that correctly? Did I get the question? Okay. So if nobody else has got something, I can either do common mistakes or common questions. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into, here's some common mistakes that people make. And I hear these things all the time. I think the most common mistakes, I usually put them on this sort of polar opposite scale. So there's like a couple of them, and the number one is overthinking. So people do this very often. They overthink the entire thing. Working with crystals is natural magic, and it's very primal. We already have a connection to these rocks, and we already have intuition to help guide us with this. So we do need to do some basic earth science research about crystals, and that's to make sure that we're using them safely. Right? So there's that two parts to working with crystals, is the science part, the magic part. So you have to do a little bit of research, but other than that, as I've been saying, it's very intuitive and highly personal work. So if you're a person who is just like fretting about all of the little details and struggling with like complex systems and what if I shouldn't put these things in a bowl, and what about this grid thing over here? You know, if it's getting really complicated, you're probably overthinking it, because working with crystals does not have to be complicated at all if you don't want it to be. You know, all the little details, timings, full moons, things, doesn't have to be complicated. So don't overthink it. But the other most common mistake, again, kind of on the opposite end of that, and you'll know which one you are, is being really lazy. People often want these really intense magical results without having to put any effort in whatsoever. Perhaps because that's how a lot of witchcraft works in the movies and stuff like that. Actually, the one work of fiction, which is an anime called Full Metal Alchemist, they have a magical system that's maybe a little more realistic than any that I've seen in a show or a movie. And their magical system requires equivalent exchange. You don't get something from nothing, right? And even working with crystals, we're not creating something out of nothing. We're creating something out of energy that we have raised or channeled, and the crystals have helped us to direct that. So if you just have crystals and you just buy them and you just sit them on a shelf and then you literally never touch them again and you don't even remember what they're called, that's not going to be very effective for you. You really do actually have to work with them and spend time communicating with them, meditating with them, kind of learning to sense their energies, listening to them, maybe get really high and just stare at them for a while, you know, whatever. And also telling them what you need their help with, keeping them cleansed, keeping them charged, you know, doing some work to help put the energy in so that you can get more out of the experience. So those are your common mistakes, is either being way too lazy or really overthinking it. Have we got any questions related to any of that, or just something that somebody came up with? I think I see somebody saying yes.
We do have another question here. Sorry. What about manifestation? Have you kind of gauged how long it generally takes for the crystal to correct or create whatever the regularly occurring outcome? And then we have someone else asking how to charge them. So there's a couple questions there for you.
Okay, so the first one's about manifestation and timing. Boy, I wish if we knew how long it took a crystal to manifest stuff, things would be so easy. Working with crystals is weird because it's a science, but it's not a science. We don't have the technology yet to really measure all of the energies that we're working with magically. And so it's incredibly hard to say how long is this going to take. I can tell you that the more energy you raise and the more energy you send, usually the faster it is. And if you're worried about timing, since we're doing natural magic, sometimes it helps to have the timing of nature on your side. So if you hook into the timing of the moon, that kind of thing, manifestation, for example, can go better closer to a full moon. And that might help speed up your timing, but it's so subjective that I couldn't give you a timetable, and I'm not sure that anybody could. What was our other question? It was cleansing or charging?
Charging.
Okay. Did I answer the manifestation question enough, or was there more there that wanted to ask? Okay, we're good.
I think I see a thumbs up.
Okay. So charging being the other one. Charging crystals is really fun. So crystals do have a kind of energy of their own, like everything has an energy of its own, right? But they also have this ability to like soak up energy and hold on to it, or kind of like slow release it, or just channel it. If you have ever had like a bonfire and then went out the next day and went, oh, there's a rock in it, and picked up the rock, it's going to burn you. I learned that the hard way because the rocks just, it like retains the heat. of the fire, and it holds onto it for like 3 days or something like that. So it's still hot, even though the fire is long gone and in ashes. And that's just kind of an example of just the nature of stones and rocks and crystals, is that they can be charged up with this energy, and then maybe they hold on to it until they need to release it, or maybe they just keep releasing it at the right time. So charging them is really fun. You can do it literally infinite ways, like anything you can imagine. If you are like the kind of practitioner who works with spirits or deities, you can use that. If you are the kind of practitioner who just works with like witchcraft and raises energy on your own, you can use that. You can use Reiki energy to charge a crystal. That kind of thing is possible. But since this is natural magic, I think I will focus on sort of the natural magic options for charging. So with the elements, you could easily charge a crystal in the earth, right? You could bury it and let it soak up the energy of the earth, especially around springtime, because that's when the energy of the earth is like growing. And really, you could charge crystals that way. You could also charge crystals with fire technically, but I don't necessarily think that would be safe to just like put them in a fire. A lot of times the fire is going to cause them to crack or explode, or it's going to change the color. So instead of using literal fire, you might want to use light. So a lot of people will use moonlight, is incredibly popular, or you can charge them by sunlight. The reason moonlight is more popular than any other kind of light is because it's not going to damage the crystal. So it's actually a lot safer. There are many crystals that will be faded and changed if they are left in sunlight for extended periods of time. But you can leave something in moonlight and it's going to be very, very gentle. And that moonlight is still going to have energy that it's pouring down onto the crystal. It's not as obvious as far as charging methods go. It doesn't feel as obvious when you're tangibly doing it, because you just kind of set it in the light and you're like, okay, well, now I guess I wait. I don't know. So it kind of helps to have like a statement of intent or something like that, to make it clear to the crystal and maybe even to the moon what you want to happen there, that you want that crystal to be charged with that energy. What have I covered? Air can also charge a crystal. Especially if you want to use smoke, like burning certain resins that are very powerful, dragon's blood is good for that. You can hold the crystal in the smoke and allow that to charge it, or just go to some place very windy and allow that to charge it. That's cool too. And water can, yeah, it's more cleansing than charging. But I could see that possibly working if you wanted to put it under running water. In general, there's some problems with putting crystals in running water, though. A lot of them can, again, degrade or be a little bit toxic or something like that. So probably my recommendation would be moonlight. It is safest and very appealing. It's fun to be out under the moonlight.
So since we covered charging crystals, we might as well, no one's asked yet, but I think it'd be good to kind of cover the reverse and cleansing crystals as well.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna kind of go through the same process almost actually that I just went through to talk about cleansing crystals. Cleansing crystals can be done in all manner of ways, but since this is natural magic we're talking about, I'll just stick to natural stuff. And I'll stick to sort of the elements. So yes, you can cleanse crystals with water. Cleansing crystals with running water is one of the ways that is the most sort of obvious to us. Like, it's very primal. Running water obviously cleans things and is obviously very clean, and will wash off your crystal. But crystals like selenite that are salt-based, certain crystals could potentially degrade, especially if left in water a lot. So just be careful what you're using to cleanse in water. I have also sometimes taken crystals out to just certain sites that are special, rivers, lakes, the ocean, whatever, and just dipped them gently, almost like a baptism, to cleanse these crystals, right? And that can be really effective too, especially just the feel of doing it and how it affects your psychology as you're watching it happen is really great. So cleansing crystals in water can be done. Earth is a cleansing option. Yes, you can bury your crystals to let them cleanse as well as to charge. So this is where people get cleansing and charging mixed up so much, because the methods are pretty much identical. And the only difference is intent and making that intent clear. What do you want to happen here? Do you want them to be cleansed? Do you want them to be charged? Grounding energies is a really effective method of cleansing anything, anyone. We can ground our own energies back into the earth. And the earth can handle it. Obviously, the earth is huge. And the earth has a way of recycling everything, and nature gets recycled. So even if it's the nastiest energy, ground it down into the earth, no problem for her, right? She's got no issue with that. And it'll all just be recycled into something new. So you can take your crystals, bury them. I would say bury them overnight just because, but really the amount of time is kind of up to you and your intuition. Like, how long do you think it's going to take for all this energy to really drain out and go back into the earth? And then you can dig them back up. And that will cleanse them really well, although they're going to technically be dirty, which is interesting. So that's fun. There's also cleansing by salt, and salt is associated with earth, unless it's sea salt, obviously. So you can also put your crystals in a bowl of salt and just kind of rub the salt around or whatever. I've done that a lot of times, but again, you do have to be careful what crystals you're putting into the salt because they can degrade. So just don't leave them in salt for a long period of time. But if you're not down for going out and digging holes in the ground, you can earth cleanse them by putting them in a bowl of salt. Air cleansing, super easy. Back before the days of COVID, I used to blow on crystals to cleanse them like in the store and stuff. And now I'm like, oh no, we're not doing that anymore. But you can cleanse them by air, especially by this herbal smudges. So like smoke. I recommend like sage and other herbal smudges for cleansing crystals constantly because again, it is one of the options that is going to be safest. Like no crystal is going to be harmed by this smoke. It's going to be fine. So you can guarantee that even if you don't remember what that crystal is called or what it's about, that it's going to be okay being cleansed through sage smoke. So that's really convenient. And fire, again, probably don't cleanse your crystals by fire. Don't stick them in your fire pit. I have accidentally lit a sulfur quartz aflame before because I totally forgot it was sulfur quartz. And some minerals and crystals are flammable. So be aware. That was a little startling. So be aware of that. But instead of actual fire, cleansing by light is an option. Cleansing by that sunlight, cleansing by that moonlight. And it's confusing because you're like, well, do I cleanse it or do I charge it? You just have to make that intention clear of what you're doing. And maybe you have to do it for 2 nights if that makes the most sense to you. Maybe you have to put it out one night and cleanse it and put it out the next night and charge it. But again, very personal, very intuitive working with crystals. So whichever is going to make the most sense and work for you, you've got to be the one who senses those energies and senses that it's cleansed. And I think those are most of the cleansing methods that I would talk about. Yeah. Did we have another question?
Yes, we do. The question is there a book you recommend that will provide info about the structure of the crystal so we know it's salt-based and not to put it in running water or other issues that could happen with crystals, I suppose?
Yes, but I can't remember the freaking name of it. Because at the store, we always call it the Big Green Book, and it's just this huge... Let me get back to you on that one. If I can take down a name, I'll figure out what that was. There are definitely crystals that are crystal books that are more science-based and crystal books that are more metaphysical-based. And honestly, usually you can just tell by the cover, because the cover of a very metaphysical crystal book has like a grid and all these pastels and like fancy font. And the cover of the science book is like, here's 3 minerals in a row, and it's very boring, and it's probably blue or green. But having an updated book, like one that is heavy on the science, definitely can be helpful for studying, you know, what it is. Also, better safe than sorry is always the way to go. I've seen a lot of memes that go around that say, have a list of like, these are crystals that you shouldn't put in water. And sometimes they're not true. Sometimes I'll look at them and be like, there's nothing wrong with putting that in water. But better safe than sorry, at least people are not throwing random crystals in water now. So that's good.
We also have a question of why would you not be able to cleanse and charge on the same night?
Well, you can if you want to, yeah. Again, it's very subjective, all of this natural magic. So it's very personal. If you feel that you can just cleanse and charge all the same time, and you make that intention clear, the energies are very fluid. Energies will work with you. Energies are like water in a container. Whatever you're like, this is my intention, this is what I want. They just fill it up and they figure it out. So you can. So for me, I mentally am like, that's not clear enough to me. Like I have to have two separate actions or else I feel confused about it. But that's just personal. So you want to do it all at once? Go for it. It'll probably work fine for you. Right.
If we don't have any other questions at the moment, maybe we can talk a little bit about different ways you can use crystals in different magical ways to use crystals.
Yeah. There's a crystal for everything, for one. So pretty much any magical goal that you could come up with, you can use a crystal for that. And it can be either just a part of your spell work, or a crystal that you carry with you, or you can have a grid, or you can build it on a little altar for a certain purpose, manifestation altar. You can wear it with you so that it's like always a part of your energy. Pretty much infinite ways to use them magically. I thought I saw someone else saying something, so.
Yes, we do have basically, does size matter, and is there a way to overload a crystal?
Interesting. I'll start with the latter. So I am of the opinion that you can overload a crystal with energy, and that's only based on my personal experiences. Some of the crystals, like hematite, is sort of the prime example, seem to burst if they have too much energy. Kind of like I was talking about, if you were to put a crystal in your bonfire, a lot of them are just going to go, right? Too much energy, too much heat, blah, blah, blah. There are some crystals that do seem to burst if they have too much energy. I've had tourmaline burst on me as well. But again, that falls into the magic side of working with crystals. So that's not like something I can prove, but I do think that it's possible. Yeah. So, and if it happens, it happens. Don't get too caught up in trying to avoid it, is what I would say. I'd hate for you to be just so cautious that you're not doing your full strength of energy work. So don't tamper yourself down, but if it happens, it happens. It's happened to me. So, and does size matter? No, it does not. Really. I have a preference for collecting larger crystals. Like, got a big old sodalite here. This is my sodalite thing. But I didn't start out that way. I didn't have a lot of money when I started out. So it was like just like little dollar stones, whatever I could get a hold of. And the size doesn't make as much difference as you would think. What really matters is having it in contact with your energy. So having that crystal either on your person, if something that you're working on really involves you, having that crystal in the right space, by your desk, under your bed, making sure that it's in contact with the energy that it needs to be in contact with. And also, often, certain geometric shapes tend to make the energy project in different ways, just slightly. That's like a subtle thing. So it's maybe even, I'm going to say advanced, not necessarily advanced, but you get good at sensing energies. There's a slight difference between the way different shapes and crystals interact. So sometimes you can get something that is like, say, a very small, but since it's shaped as a pyramid, makes it kind of strong, and that's really nice. So no, size really isn't that important. That just kind of comes down to preference and whether or not you like to have a big honking crystal. All crystals do share, I don't really have a word for this. I'm going to go ahead and call it crystal consciousness. they've got that same structure. So like every amethyst I have in my house, they're all amethyst. They all have that same structure in common. And just like how humans have this kind of collective human consciousness, the crystal has a kind of collective consciousness. And because of that, those same energies, even from a very small crystal, it's got the same energies. It's got the same symbolism. And if you get really good at energy work, you can just channel tons of energy through even the smallest crystal. So no, it sort of is more about how good you are with the energy work and less about the size of the crystal.
We also have the question about the beginner crystal spell, which seems similar to beginner crystals. And then there's also one about using crystals as magical alarms.
Magical alarms? Okay, could we be more specific that question? Because I've not heard that. So if we could maybe rephrase it in more details. Is this like in the sense of using them for protection? For some reason, I'm thinking like my morning alarm when I wake up in the morning. It's like ring, 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 ring.
Whoever's asking that, you feel free to unmute and talk if you
Yeah, if you'd like to.
That would help.
Yeah.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, hey, so basically what I was thinking was, crystals have their own spirit or consciousness, right? So they can be programmed to create very specific effects. So what about the idea of using crystals kind of like as a guardian or as a sort of boundary for your house, or to basically kind of trying to think of the best way to describe it, basically kind of alert you if a specific event occurs. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That has absolutely been done. Hold my beer. I'll be right back. So this is my home protector. This guy right here. He's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, you absolutely can program crystals for home protection. And if you're good at sensing their energy and good at picking up energy from them, then yeah, they can alert you if something is wrong. As long as you are also in the state of mind to be able to pick up whatever messages they're sending you. Because working with energy, it kind of goes both ways. You have to be in the right state. You have to develop your own senses, right? And then the energies coming at you also have to be kind of clear and strong. So you have to meet in the middle. So you can absolutely do that. I was gonna say one more thing. It was about house protection crystals. I think I've forgotten it though. They can be used really good for protection. And people use all kinds of spirits for all kinds of things, right? So they'll make guardian spirits or whatever. Plant spirits are a very common thing that people will work with. I find that crystal spirits are very different. I have found them to be, obviously crystals are very different from humanity in their makeup. And I find the crystal kind of consciousness to be very different from humanity as well. So they're a little less human in my experience, is what I would say. Not that they're difficult to work with, but it's definitely not the same as working with something like a plant spirit or something that is like an angelic spirit or the human spirit at all, because they are rocks. So they got that rock frame of mind. Was there another? I think there was another question.
Someone asked, does it work like a repellent? I'm assuming as far as the protection aspect, using them as protection thing goes.
Yeah, it can. It can kind of work however you program it to work. So I specifically have points for the reason of repelling, because points tend to be very projective of energy, right? They're very assertive. So using crystals that kind of have those points on them tend to be a good way to project energy, and I'll program them up like a sheet. So you can program that crystal, you charge it up, and you tell it that intention of what you want it to do to send out energy in a shield around you. And it will last until it doesn't last anymore, and then, you know, charge it up again. Or you can do some complex stuff to keep it constantly charging. But anyway, natural magic. We're focusing on natural magic here. So yeah. It can be used like a shield to project. It can also be used, there's a lot of other forms of protection that you can use a crystal for. One of the more passive forms that I have used is the kind of make me invisible energy idea. So getting a certain crystal to carry on you to help change sort of just the aura around you so that it's perceived differently so that you're not being noticed. So if you are a person who sort of struggles with doing projective magic and you're not so good at like sending energy out, maybe you're more of a timid, passive person, you can also just use some disappear energy work and things like that to help keep you protected. What else have we got? Anything? I can dig into some more notes here. Okay. So I've got some common questions here. So for common questions, one of the complicated subjects that people are often very confused about is the crystal names, like what they're being called, and they're getting things mixed up from this crystal to the other. And there's a lot of good reason for that. It's because it's a combination of like history, science, capitalism, and trademark law that gets involved when it comes to what crystals are called. So none of it makes a lot of sense. Instead of having this really nice, unique, like 2-word scientific Latin name like all of the animals do, right? Crystals have more like this entire chart of physical properties that isn't really helpful to anyone who's not doing science. So we end up having all these common names for them. It's just what people have been calling them. One of the problems with that is that common names change over time. So it was called something and then it changed. So somewhere at some point in history, and that makes it confusing. So some of them stick around, but some of them change. So like citrine was originally yellow quartz, and sometime in like the 1500s, they named it citrine. And now everyone calls it citrine, and nobody would call it yellow quartz. That would be weird. But even recently, like heliotrope is now called bloodstone, and people were still calling it heliotrope back in like the 90s. So that's a pretty recent one where the name of a crystal will change, even though it's the same thing. Very confusing. Sometimes different crystals are given the same name too. So there's like probably 3 different kinds of stones that are just called sunstone, but they're completely different crystals. Again, you have to get into the science to know like which version of sunstone it actually is or what version you're looking for. And then some names are really misleading. So if you have rainbow moonstone, it's actually not at all the same kind of crystal as any of the other moonstones. It's the same kind of crystal as a labradorite. But it's called rainbow moonstone, even though it's not a moonstone. So that's a mess. And then there are also a lot of crystals that have trademarked names because capitalism, right? So crystal mines are all owned by companies. Somebody owns the land, somebody owns the mine, somebody is making sure that, you know, the mining happens and the crystals are dug up in certain areas. So those companies have the right to trademark the crystals that come out of their mine technically. So it might be just an amethyst, but if it came out of that space, they could give it some crazy name. And then often people will come into shops looking for, well, I'm looking for, you know, azumar. Well, it's just calcite. We have calcite here, but no, we don't have calcite from that specific mine. So it's not technically azumar. So that gets crazy. The Herkimer Diamond is a pretty good example of this, because a Herkimer Diamond is a double terminated quartz. That's all it is. And double terminated quartz can be found technically anywhere in the world, but these specific ones, which are really nice quality from Herkimer County, New York, have been trademark named Herkimer Diamonds. They are diamond shaped, I guess, so that's why they're called that. But it causes problems. So keeping up with the crystal names is really a huge hassle. And you have to get some books and you have to do some research about that to try to figure out what's what. But just keep in mind that sometimes people are calling the same thing by like different names. And we have to just accept that that's kind of a communication barrier when we're talking with people so that we don't get into too many arguments about it. Crystal names are always going to be confusing. They just are. Let me check for questions real quick before I go further. Nope. Okay.
Now we've got one.
Okay.
Says, so you mentioned points are good for protection. What would round stones have a different effect?
Yeah, I tend to think spheres do have a different effect. But this all comes down to like very subtle crystal energy work. So some of it just has to do with psychology and with our own ideas about shapes and how they function. And then we kind of impress that intention on the crystals when we're programming them. And so that's how they know to respond a certain way. I think spheres are also pretty good for shielding because they have that circular thing going on. I think spheres are also very good for obviously scrying. That's what spheres are classically known for. And I do find more circular crystals to be gentle, personally. I think that they let out energy in a way that's very gentle. So if you're looking for stones that are like calming, relieve anxiety, you might want to kind of add an additional thing to that and specifically find one that is round and smooth and that will be more calming. And different crystal points as well have been used for different purposes. So like Lumerian point quartz, it's just a quartz in a specific kind of shape, and they call it the Lumerian Quartz. And there are a bunch of these same kinds of things where it's a quartz point, but it comes in a specific shape, so they have a name for it. And people have assigned a meaning to what that is. So maybe the one that has a big quartz and a little quartz next to it might be called like the mother-daughter quartz point. And because we've assigned that meaning to it, it just kind of helps us to have a better way to use them. So Lumerian quartz points have been used mostly for cord cutting and just like cutting energies in general. So if you have like a nasty attachment to anything, let's say alcohol, that's a really nice one. If you have a nasty attachment to alcohol, you use the Lumerian quartz point to cut away from your energy and kind of separate you from that thing. Or you use it for any kind of cord cutting. And points are often very good for healing and magic in general because they do have that projective shape.
All right, we have another question in the chat. What about meteorite stones? Is that energetic and spiritually different from natural occurring stones on Earth?
I mean, only because we think so. Again, a lot of this is very subjective, but it's not completely illogical. So someone once asked me, I think it was Jeffrey, why do the people who write crystal books not cite their sources? Why are they not saying, you know, where they got this information? If moldavite means this, why are they not saying where they got that from? And it's because they didn't get it from anywhere. They just made it up. It's all subjective. What they're really writing is their own personal opinion of how these crystals should be used. Maybe there's some history involved. And when there's history involved, that's cool because we say, okay, people have been using amethyst for this purpose for thousands of years. We have good reason to believe that that's probably still going to work. That's a good thing. But a lot of crystals are relatively new. They don't really have a lot of history. They were kind of only recently discovered and not written about. So in that case, how do we know what it's for? And really the only answer is personal intuition. You work with it yourself and you say, okay, for me, this makes sense. And I feel this, and that's what I'm going to use it for. And you throw some logic into it. Like, it makes sense to us that stones that are very heavy and red or earth colored are going to be grounding stones. That's where we come up with it. It's all just basic logic. We're like, well, this is a grounding stone. So it also makes sense to us that stones that come from outer space are going to deal with spirituality, are going to deal with abstract concepts and things that are beyond our normal understanding. So it is related to that, mostly because we say it's related to that. And it's something we build with the energies of that crystal. We listen to it, we talk to it, we use our own intuition. I don't see why you couldn't use a meteorite for grounding if you really wanted to. I mean, it did come all the way down to the ground. So, but again, it makes sense, yeah, for it to be for that. Have we got anything else?
Not at the moment, no.
You just got to use the logic that works for you and use your own intuition to sense these things. But because it's so highly personal, the natural magic that we work with, it is important to remember that it's really silly to go around correcting other people. Like if someone's like, I use citrine for joy and happiness, you can't just go around and be like, no, citrine's for your third eye. Like that's really silly. This is very personal, natural stuff. And we all have very individual energies that interact with those crystal energies. So you might interact with crystals a certain way, and the energy of someone else, it's very different. They have to use those crystals very different. So keep that in mind. Let me see what else I might have written down here. Got some common questions. And I think I've already sort of talked on this, but one of the more common questions is people coming up and saying, you know, what does this crystal mean? And usually the short answer is for me to just tell them what it means to me, right? Because I don't have all day, and I'm not going to sit here and explain to you this whole concept of how like crystals are very subjective. But in this class, I will. Yeah, there is no objective way to definitely say this crystal symbolizes this. This crystal does this. This crystal, blah, blah, blah. It's all intuitive, all very personal. You know, there's no objectively right or wrong answer. When it comes to the magical side of working with crystals, when it comes to the science side of working with crystals, it is the exact opposite. There is a right, there is science. We can measure this. And definitely, you know, a calcite is not the same crystal as a quartz. So it's a very strange thing to be practicing crystal magic, and that it has just both ends of that scale of just, you know, absolute science that is definite, and also the magic that is so fluid and not definite.
We have another question in the chat that is kind of jumping off that in some ways.
Okay.
The question is, how do the scientific breakthroughs that determine atomic structure and composition factor into changing magical meanings of certain crystals, or do they?
They do, and again, it's kind of only because we say they do. When we learn more about crystals, usually what happens, we'll have a scientific breakthrough, and then now that we've learned more about that crystal, somebody who's a huge nerd about rocks and is also like a very popular author will write a book about it. And they'll be like, this crystal is for all of these things, because they know about all of the scientific breakthroughs that have been happening. And when that happens, it kind of just leaks out into the public, and it becomes just sort of our common knowledge. And it does change how we view the crystal, how we work with the crystal. It takes a little time, but yes, it changes how we work with the crystal, and it changes that because we let it, and because people want it to change. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the more we learn, the more that we have to keep adapting our practices. And we wouldn't want to only use ancient crystals and just like never use anything that was newly discovered. That would be ridiculous. So it's an evolving practice, working with crystals. We got any other questions?
I have a couple of things that might be interesting to talk about or that
Okay.
or address. how to tell or what happens when crystals are dyed, if how to tell if they're fake or it's treated somehow and how that changes things.
Yeah, good question. The very polite term that we use in the store is color treated. This is a color treated crystal, which means dyed. And I'm a big fan of like natural rocks that are raw, rocks that came out of the earth. I like that nature energy myself. But I know a lot of other people work with the dyed crystals and don't have an issue with that at all. So I think that's kind of a personal preference. Dyed crystals kind of potentially introduce an extra level of magic because you're introducing an extra color. Color psychology and color magic is it's like its whole own thing. So it could actually be beneficial to have the crystals that are dyed in the different colors. I'm just a big fan of trying to find the natural crystal in that color myself. But again, sometimes certain colors are very hard to find. Some crystals are going to be very rare. Another option that there is, and I've actually got one here, are the aura crystals. So that's an Aqua aura quartz. That's the most popular one, and you might not be able to see it super well. But aura crystals have not been dyed, but they're also not natural. They're electromagnetic plated. So they superheat a bunch of metals, like different combinations of metals, and they shoot it at the quartz, and it fuses with the outer atom all the way around the quartz. This technology actually came from like space exploration because it's what they use on the outside of like the astronaut windows that makes them all gold and shiny, right? So it's electromagnetic plating stuff. And that's interesting. I've had better luck with that for some reason than I have with dyed crystals. Maybe just because it's more thoroughly fused. So you can't break off the coating of an aura crystal. It's there, it's a part of the crystal now. It's not gonna wash off in any way. And aura crystals are pretty insane. There's new ones coming out all of the time, just constantly by using different combinations of metals. So they range from orange to, metallic colored to blue, purple, green, whatever. And they always have that same shimmery, shiny, metallic look on them. And they're called all kinds of different things. So you cannot keep the name straight on these, but you do your best. But everybody's always like, well, I added a little bit more titanium on this one. So this one's a little more blue. So I'm going to give it a completely different name. And this one is now like super cobalt blue, blah, blah, blah. But aura crystals are interesting. So I think that dyes and aura does sort of introduce something else to the mix of crystals. I also do know that a lot of people, can't have access to the really rare crystals like I do. So you can find and still work with dyed crystals. You can find a crystal for whatever you need that's low price, for the record. You don't have to get the most rare thing in the box. There is a substitute, right? There is a crystal that does that exact same thing, or at least very, very close to that thing that's probably only $1, as opposed to the $95 moldavite that you wanted. So speaking of inexpensive crystals while we're at it, my current obsession is Jasper. And it's kind of always been an obsession, but I'm a little more into it lately because we got some really good ones in the shop. Jasper is one of the most underrated crystals, I swear, on the planet, okay? It comes in like every possible color. Like Bumblebee Jasper is one of the brightest yellows you're gonna get, all kinds of earthy colors. And to me, this just means that there is a Jasper for everything. Like, Jasper is that friend who will always help you out and hang out with you no matter what you're doing. There's a Jasper for that. Like some friends you're like, okay, we'll go to the football game with, but we're not gonna like hang out at home and color. But then some friends are just like, whatever you're doing, I'm down. That's Jasper. So as far as underrated crystals, you can get a Jasper in any color and they're good for all sorts of stuff and they're never expensive. yeah, they're not terribly expensive. So Jasper, try that. We got any questions?
Yeah, someone asked, what about heat treating to change them, like amethyst to citrine or vice versa, or calling satin spar selenite? I'm not sure.
I'll start with the heat treating and then get back around to that one. So I'm of the opinion that heat is a pretty natural thing, right? So you added heat to something, no big deal. So for those of you who don't know, citrine is an excellent example. Sometimes, and usually it's with citrine, stones are heat treated before they get sold. So natural citrine is usually very, very pale yellow or very brownish. Citrine does happen naturally. You can find it, we sell it, that kind of thing, but it's not very common. Whereas amethyst is incredibly common. Amethyst is found all over the world and easy to get to. So the vast majority of citrine stones being sold at crystal shops were originally amethyst. Then they have had heat added to them, which changed the color and turned them into that golden yellow classic citrine that we know, and transformed them into something else. And then, of course, they've got a different name. So your citrine was born as an amethyst and transitioned into a citrine. I think that's fantastic. I don't have a problem with the fact that they added heat to it, because there's not really anything unnatural about adding heat. And it does occur in nature, it just didn't in this case. But I also just love citrine. So yeah, but sometimes they'll add heat to crystals, that kind of thing. So if you're really opposed to that, just make sure that you're like asking those kinds of questions. That's funny. I just saw that chat. So just make sure you're asking those kinds of questions when you buy them. You're asking, have any of these been heat treated? Is this an electromagnetic plated quartz? Is this like an aura quartz, or is this natural? You can ask, and hopefully the people selling it to you, they should know. If they don't know, get some books. What was the second part of that question?
Or calling satin spar selenite.
Oh, okay. That kind of comes down to what I was talking about with names earlier. We don't have any nice, clear, simple two-part Latin names for these crystals. People call them all kinds of things. And whatever ends up being the most common word name for it is what it goes by, even if it's very misleading. Even if you're calling it rainbow moonstone and it's not a moonstone, it's actually a labradorite. It's unfortunate that the names can be misleading like that. It really does kind of suck. So you just sort of have to do your research with it and know what you're getting into, really. So the easiest way is to not be picky. Like if you're not picky and you're like, I don't have a lot of preferences, I don't care if my crystals are natural or not, go you. That'll make it really easy to do your work and stuff. Because they're still crystals and they're still going to have energy and you're still going to have a great time with them. So crystal identification is just another little note that I had to maybe talk about. And this is because I'm in a lot of online groups, obviously, and there's like inevitably always someone who takes like a couple blurry pictures of their crystals and puts it on there and goes, what's this? What's this? And probably a lot of you have done it, which is fine. Like it's cool. But as a person who works with all of this stuff and works in a shop where we identify a bunch of crystals, I want to be clear that like technically you cannot definitely identify a crystal by a photo. Like it cannot be done, because part of crystal identification is about how it feels, about its hardness, that kind of thing. So technically you may or may not ever get the correct answer by a photo, especially if it's a blurry one. Additionally, a lot of crystals can only really be identified by the way they react to light. like blue aventurine and dumortierite, if they're both tumbled, they're nigh impossible to tell apart unless you hold them up to the light and you find the flecks that are in aventurine. So there are a lot of like, you have to look at the shimmer to know what kind of crystal it is that happens. So because I know everyone's going to continue to do that anyway, if you are struggling to identify crystals and, you know, maybe struggling to find it in your book, or you just haven't got a book to identify them yet and you're posting them on your groups, best thing to do is post a video of the crystal in natural light so that we can see it better. And a lot of times the crystal that you have is going to be one of the most common crystals, right? So there are some crystals that are really commonly sold and just about anybody can look at it and be like, yes, that is black tourmaline. It's pretty obvious, but you know, technically crystal identification can be a lot more complicated than that. So also one thing that helps, not only doing a video where we can sort of see the light interacting with the crystal, but telling the price helps a lot, and the location that you're in, because obviously crystal pricing varies from area to area, East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, that kind of thing. But if you say, you know, here's this crystal, this is what I paid for it, that could make a huge difference, at least to me, if someone's talking to me about a crystal and trying to get a feel of like what this crystal is. If they say the price, I'm like, oh, well, then it's probably that more rare one or whatever. Or if they're like, well, it was only $1, I'm like, yeah, it's definitely not that rare stone. Nobody sold that for $1, saying didn't happen. But so light's a factor. All of those things are factors for identifying crystals. And you can mostly do it yourself with a book, but I get that we all want second opinions, right? So anybody have any further crystal questions going on? We've got a full moon coming up very soon. Technically, I guess tonight, but a full moon phase is like about 3 days. So really good time to cleanse or charge those crystals, or both at once. Just do some energy work with the crystals and the moon.
I do have another option to touch on if you can and want to. Ethical sourcing of crystals.
Oh gosh, I knew that would come up. People do their best. Like, ethical sourcing of crystals is really difficult for a larger store, especially, and I think it probably is for small stores too, because crystals go through like so many gates before they get to the shop. They do, like they go through a lot of hands. And so we, like at Aquarius, we get crystals from like a huge number of vendors, and we try to always ask and talk to these vendors and say, were they ethically sourced, right? And they tell us, yes, they're ethically sourced, but then we just kind of have to believe them, because you just hit dead ends when you're trying to trace back where the crystal came from and this and that. So ethical sourcing is actually very hard with crystals. I got to be honest about that. I wish I had a solution for saying this is what you do to definitely get ethically sourced crystals. But the best we can really do is just make sure that if you get the chance to talk to crystal wholesalers, if you get the chance to talk to business owners, just let them know that it's a priority for you. Because the more that the public says we care about this thing, the more that the people running it are going to have to do that, because that's just good business. They respond to what the buyers want. So as long as you just make sure that, you know, everyone knows that you care about that, that's about the biggest difference we can make right now in ethical sourcing. It is what it is.
All right. We did have another question. Do you have recommendations on how to effectively absorb knowledge about stones without getting overwhelmed?
Yeah, I feel that. Because there's so much out there. And I know that, like, if you were to look up a rose quartz online, you're going to get like 12 different contradicting articles saying that it's used for this or that or the other thing, or that it corresponds to this tarot card or it corresponds to that element, you know, and they're all contradicting. So very overwhelming. My suggestions are a couple of things. first, you could try to dig into the history of the crystal. So if you just want to base your crystal correspondences off history and just kind of be like, what was this used for historically? Look up the ancient history of the crystal and see, you know, whatever cultures we're using for historically. That's one way to narrow it down. Where that kind of falls flat is when it comes to like modern crystals that have only sort of recently been dug up and things like that. And then you don't have any history and you just have to go off your intuition. Another thing you could do is you could pick an author that you just really like and then just stick with their system. Whatever they wrote down in their books, whatever correspondences they gave you, you can just say, all right, I like this system. I'm going to choose this system. And you can just keep working within that. And that simplifies it for you as well. Although the one problem with that is that then you're kind of like restricted to only the crystals that that author is writing about. So depending on whether you want to branch out past that. Again, ultimately, it kind of comes down to like your own intuition when you figure out how to work with the crystals. But I can understand how having to make the decision yourself is very overwhelming for like each crystal. And you're like, oh, right, I have to figure out what each one of them means and how to use them. And that's a lot. Give it time for one, because over time, the longer you work with them, the more you just kind of start to develop a system about things. Most of my crystals kind of fit into the chakra system because one of the things I have experience doing is with crystal chakra healing. So over time, I realized that I really liked that system and I just applied that to my crystals. And pretty much all my crystals, if I'm trying to figure out what they mean, if I'm trying to figure out the best ways to use them, I pay attention to their color and I correspond them back to the chakra system. And I am talking about, by the way, the modern 7 chakra system that has the rainbow colors. It is an adapted version of the ancient Indian chakra system, which was vastly more complicated. So complicated is not what we're going for here. You kind of just have to pick a system and stick to it. And that's about the only way to do it. And you can always change the system later if you decide you don't like it. So that's not a big deal. Okay, anybody else? Let me look at what I've got on my notes. This is kind of out there, but while working with my crystals, I do a lot of trance work, so meditation, getting into a trance state, and then working with the crystals to figure out messages from them. So kind of journeying, and it involves kind of visions and things of that nature, and getting to know that specific crystal. So that's a really cool way to very like deeply connect with the crystals that you're using, more than just sensing their energies, really getting into it. In my trance work, I have been sort of very thrilled to find that there is this unique connection between crystals and time. And that's what I've been sort of excited about lately. Now, to be clear, all trance work is again subjective and personal. There's this thing called like gnosis and like verified gnosis. So sometimes you have like a vision and that's just something that is personal to you and that's cool. And then also sometimes you have a vision and there's maybe records of that same thing happening in history, or lots of other people have said that same kind of symbolism happened to them. And then it's more verified, and then normally you are in a better place to share it with people. So this is just sort of a personal thing, but I've been thinking a lot about time and how crystals, I have started using them magically to sort of like either help me change my perception of time. Like, for example, days going by too quickly and I want to slow down and better appreciate my time. And so I use the crystal to help me be more mindful, or to sort of capture moments in time, to like memorialize a certain moment in time or a memory, a kind of thing that I want to be held energetically there. If you think about how crystals form, they sort of are very, very slow in their process. If you think about their formation and kind of decay as like a growth process, they last a lot longer than even the oldest trees. They are just like carrying on that wisdom through thousands and thousands of years of time, which is very, very interesting. So working with crystals in time can be very intriguing. There's actually like quartz that have formed with little bubbles of water in them, and that's pretty rare, but we have some of those at the shop. And those bubbles of water that are trapped inside of that quartz are like hundreds of years old. Like that is 100-year-old water right there, and it will never come out of that quartz unless you break it. And amber is obviously a great example of how crystals have this weird relationship with time and with slowing things down and with holding on to things from the past. Amber is a tree resin, technically, but when it gets fossilized, it kind of ends up in our weird sort of crystal category there. But we all know that amber will capture like insects and dinosaur bits and whatever, and then crystallize it and just hold on to it forever. So if you want to work with time and work with crystals, that's something fun and trippy to do. Okay. So has anybody got any like problems that they've had with crystals when they've tried working with them? Not so much. I guess we can talk about crystal healing then, because that is something that I have done as well. So that was actually one of the earliest things I started doing, was trying to use crystals to heal myself. I think I've got it here. The first crystal I ever got, of course I'm fond of this baby, this is a raw Chrysocola. From the start, I was like, I want the really fancy, nice one, of course. That was me. So, and it is related to the sacral chakra. It is related to sort of the womb and the waters and to healing. So I was trying to use it to help heal sort of my really messy menstrual cycle that I had going on there. So you can use crystals for healing. Usually what I like to do is to place them on or around my body, which is really easy. It's very simple. So meditating, placing them on you. It's interesting to notice the sensations, because some of them that you would think that they would all be cold because they're rocks, but some of them are actually not really very cold when they touch you. And then some of them do seem to be wonderfully cooling. And I think that's just about the way we perceive the energies. Like we perceive the energies of crystals in all sorts of ways, and everybody feels it in different ways. Maybe you can feel it when you work with healing. And it's a good way to attune yourself to the crystals too, and get used to working with them. Let's see. We can also cover crystals and sex. Yes, I am totally willing to go there. Yes, there are crystal dildos and crystal yoni eggs that are out there for people to use. To be clear, I am not a doctor. I am not a health expert. I am about as qualified as anyone else in my state for teaching sex ed, but I don't teach sex ed. And that's totally the state's fault. Quartz crystal dildos and quartz crystal yoni eggs are the ones that I will always be able to recommend as being pretty much safe and cool. Like if it's quartz, rose quartz, amethyst, it's probably fine. You can totally use that in your body. It's going to be good. And that's because it's not porous, and it's not breakable. It's not anything like that. Obviously, there are a lot of other crystals that are not safe to put in your body. Anything that is porous at all is going to carry bacteria inside of it, and that can cause like bacterial infections. So look up what kind of crystal you're using and make sure that it's nothing porous or nothing toxic. There's obviously toxic rocks like we've talked about that have minerals in them that you wouldn't want to put in your body, because that's not going to go well for you. So quartz, I can give my approval and say that's going to be pretty much safe, but anything else you really want to research. Yoni eggs only go in the yoni. They are not designed to go elsewhere, and it would not be safe to put them elsewhere. So we'll just say that. But yes, so crystals are also a part of all that sacred sexuality stuff that people do, right? Crystals can just be used for anything, anything. So now we've got all kinds of ideas. What are we going to be doing for the full moon tomorrow? Are we all charging crystals? Let's see. Oh, I did want to mention that when it comes to looking for crystals, some crystals, we always have people coming in looking for like peridot, and they're like, yeah, but I want like chunk of peridot, and it doesn't exist. So some crystals, they only grow in this kind of like very bubbly little bitty formation. So even the largest versions of peridot are not very big because they're kind of bubbly, and that's just how they work. So some crystals really can't get giant chunks of it. On the other hand, something like smoky quartz, there's smoky quartz in the world that is 5 times my size. It is like bigger than me in these caves. Naturally, that exists. All shapes and sizes with the crystals. It does. It is super cool. I'm just going off of what crystals I've got like collected around me, because before this I was like, I'm just gonna pick up a whole bunch of crystals and set them all here, and then we'll see what happens. So the most rare crystal I own, because I'm gonna show off because I'm like that, is the one that, as far as I know, only our shop has had it maybe ever. It's called Rainbow Lattice Sun Moonstone. So here we have sunstone, here we have moonstone, and what this rainbow lattice stone is the only known example of sunstone and moonstone forming together at the same time. So it's got the shimmery moonstone stuff going on, and it has the orange sparkly sunstone stuff going on. One mine in Australia has it in the whole world. So really cool stuff, pretty incredible. I love the symbolism of it. I love that I feel like it is a unity of 2 polar opposites, a unity of maybe masculine and feminine, you know, the sun and the moon, whatever you want to look at. The unity of whatever is binary, of opposites coming together in just like harmony. And I think that's really cool in a crystal. Another one that is a good crystal of balance is Snowflake Obsidian. It's got that black and white spotted thing going on. Lunakite is another very balanced crystal. Lunakite has sort of pink and green, and I often recommend it for emotional balance. I have some issues with my hormones, so I kind of recommend it for that too, because if you got hormone issues, you've got emotional problems. That's what happens when your hormones are shifting all the time. So emotional balance, there's a lot of good crystals that are very good at helping us sort of come back to center and keep ourselves in balance in life.
We did get a couple more questions in here.
Okay.
I'll read you both of them and you can decide which to address first. When meditating with crystals, do you recommend holding or just looking at it? And the other one is, are blue lace agates no longer being mined everywhere? Or was it just out of one mine they came from and are no longer being mined there?
I'll start with the last one. There is one mine of blue lace agates that shut down that I know of, and I think it was one of the more popular ones for retailers because we have had like a blue lace agate shortage going on. So I think it was one of the mines that sold a lot, but they're still being mined in other places, and eventually they should come back around because agate is one of the most abundant just crystals in general on the earth. So I find it very hard to believe that there's not more blue lace agate out there just waiting to be like dug up and make its way into the stores, which is a long process, by the way. So I think it will return, fortunately. And what was the other question? It was
when meditating, do you recommend holding it or just looking at it?
both. I am a big fan of both in every way. I love both. Yeah, I first experienced crystal energy by feeling it with my hands. Like the first time that I experienced that energy, I could like feel the buzzing sensation from holding it. And then as I worked with it more, I developed the ability to see the energy around the crystal, to see kind of these auras that are going on around that. So if you're holding it and you're looking at it, and, you know, especially if you're meditating and getting yourself into a good state, getting into a little bit of a trance, you have potential to feel both, multiple ways to be able to sense the energy of the crystal. All right, so one of the other crystals I have here is Danburite. I love Danburite. That's an uncommon one. One thing that's kind of unique about Danburite for me is because it's one of the only crystals that I've ever really started saying was a high vibrational crystal. I usually don't like that term because I feel like it just gets really overused and blown out of proportion. Everyone's like, I want high vibration crystals. And often they have this sort of false idea about what that means. So sometimes people will say like high vibrations are good and low vibrations are toxic. And I've never known that to be actually true. High vibrations are something other, something spiritual, something kind of outside of the body. High vibrations are all about abstract concepts and all about sort of being more, all about the mind, you know, like doing the thing that you know you need to do mentally, making the good decision, even though you don't want to. But low vibrational stuff is very primal, and that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you've got a handle on it and keeping it in check, right? So those primal emotions can be very playful. They can give us a lot of passion, right? They can be very good. The problem is when people aren't working with both of them and they don't have them in balance. And maybe they're being very needy because they have a need that isn't being met, and they're just like taking it out on other people because they're just caught up in that primal vibration and they're not balancing it with also the higher thought saying, okay, this is what's going on and I need to address this in a better way. So I don't love those terms for talking about crystals. But if I use them in that way. So a lower vibrational crystal is going to be something that's very grounding, going to be something that gets you in touch with your humanity, which we all kind of are like, ew, humans, but being human is pretty cool, honestly. We're pretty amazing creatures. We're really wild and unpredictable and strange, but it's pretty cool. And yeah, there are some crystals that, especially due to like their origin, because it makes sense to us, we say this is high vibrational because it came from space or whatever, helps us to connect with spirituality better. And that's also cool. Then again, if your spirituality is earth-based, then maybe the crystal you need to connect to spirituality are earthy crystals, are grounded crystals, are low vibrational crystals. Depending on what your spirituality is. If your spirituality is more based in like the heavens, if you're trying to sort of do that Eastern monk thing and ascend and break away from your attachments, then maybe those are, yeah, high vibrational crystals are what you want. Stuff that has to do with the mind, has to do with abstract concepts. But you have to think about that for yourself and think about where you are on that scale.
We had another question. It says, going back to the beginning, we mentioned combos. Any combos that you found to be particularly cool or interesting?
Oh goodness, I carry so many combinations of stones. That's going to be really hard. The combo that I've been working with right now is fluorite, dumortierite, and rhodochrosite. Rhodochrosite and dumortierite have healing in common. So there is heart healing going on there, and there is light communication healing going on there. So that's kind of cool. And then fluorite is also associated with the mind and with meditation and being able to shift mental states, being able to learn things. So as a combination of crystals, I am like just covering from my heart to the top of my head, my energy. So that's the combination I'm working with now that I really like. I think sometimes doing the balance of sort of the very like high vibration crystals that are associated with crown chakra or whatever, and those low vibration crystals that are associated with grounding could be a really interesting mix to carry around with you. I don't do that. I've tried it and it was like a little unsettling for me, and I probably should do that, but I was just like, okay, I'm too back and forth about this. So I usually kind of pick like one area of my life that I'm trying to work on and just carry a combination that all falls into that category personally. All right. I don't have a lot more on the list, I don't think. If we haven't got more questions. And that's the thing about working with crystals and it being natural magic is kind of like I said in the beginning, it's not overly complicated if you don't want it to be. Like it does not have to be this whole academic thing. It's mostly just very nature oriented and very intuitive because it's just a part of all of us. So in that case, the only really thing that matters is just knowing enough of the science to keep yourself safe and developing your own ability to communicate with these crystals and to sense them. And there are a lot of different ways to do that, to develop, you might call it psychic ability, to develop psychic ability so that you can sense the crystals. I did develop mine over time, so it was probably like 5 years before I could really like see crystal auras and also have visions when I would meditate with a crystal, which is interesting. A lot of other magical practices just came to me very easily, and they were just sort of like natural gifts or whatever, but actually working with crystals did take me a lot of time, and it can be done. You can get very intense with them if you keep working with them over time, and some of you won't even have to do that much work. Some of you will just take to it, and it will be kind of natural for you, and you'll just get the crystals. So
all right, do we have any other questions or comments that anybody wants to add?
I think that's it.
All right, well, I want to say thank you to Katarina for joining us tonight. If you have a link to that book, if you put it in the Facebook event, I'll try to make sure and put it in the Meetup event as well. So we have a link to that and a good reference book. And I think I'll say once again, I posted links to our Patreon page on both Meetup and in the Facebook event. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you, Katarina, for talking to us about crystals and working with crystals tonight.
Have a good night, everybody.